So the conversation would often go to, well, that means you must believe everything about the Bible. And I'll say, well, yes, I do. And then, of course, we get a bit of a laugh, understandably. And I'm not being that critical of the person, but often they haven't even read the Bible. So they want to laugh at it because it just feels silly. And we then begin to feel a bit silly. Well, why am I believing the Bible? Goodness me. Yeah, maybe they're right. I feel a bit foolish. And then our faith gets smaller and smaller. And that picture up there that you can see as you came in with the boy looking terrified is how we feel inside. We wish we'd never started the conversation. So somebody asked a question before we came tonight, which was, well, how was the Bible ever written? That's a big question, isn't it? How was it written? The Bible itself claims to be inspired by God. Now, it itself claims that. So that's no proof at all, is it? That's just its own book claiming something which is quite remarkable. So I think it's a very good question that somebody can ask us. Well, how do we know it's true and all of that? So I'll just move on to that now. So I'm going to cover these things quite quickly. The reason being, we're going to spend a little bit more time on a couple of questions that I think are very difficult to answer. And we'll spend a bit more time on those. For example, such as, why do bad things happen to good people? And why is there so much pain and suffering in the earth if there's a God of love? Big questions. We've got to be so gentle and careful how we approach those, because there are a lot of people in a lot of pain, and it's very, very real. So I want to spend a little bit of time just gently easing into those questions. But these are just as important. So the Bible, where many years ago, it was in the Jewish nation, there were what they call prophets, real men that we've established lived historically, wrote books. Some of them were named after themselves. They were on scrolls, all independent, and they were used by the nation of Israel. That's what they were used by. And some of them are talking about how to live. Some of them are talking about what they thought might happen. Others are talking about the nature of God. Others were songs and psalms. All sorts of books were written individually. And as in the New Testament, when those people that met Jesus wrote their books, and Jesus himself and the Apostle Paul, who was one of the earliest apostles starting the Christian faith, they wrote about and they referred to these old books. Jesus particularly quoted from them again and again and again and again and again. But as the years went by, or maybe 300 or 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 years before Christ, so a long time ago, it was becoming more difficult for the Jewish nation to capture these books. And so they were put together. And that's what we call the Old Testament. But there were more books that were written, and we call those the Apocrypha. There were more than we've got. Did you know that? There were more books written that were claimed to be part of the Bible than is in our Bible today. How crazy is that? And you might hear the phrase called the Apocrypha. And there were about 14 other books that were written by other people in the time pre-Christ. We call the Old Testament the ancient world. And those, there they are. So why are they not in the Bible? Well, the books that we do have in the Bible have lots of claims. It's an old-fashioned word, but don't let it put you off. It's called prophecy. And they talk about things that will happen. Some of them have come true. There's one, for example, prophecy, where there are dozens and dozens, almost into the hundreds, of detail about the person called Jesus. And of course, historically, we know that Jesus was born and did live. We know that. And these Old Testament books talk about that in so much detail that only somebody who had that revealed to them, like Annette revealing about the cake, only those who had that revealed to them could possibly have known so much detail. There's a book called Daniel in the Old Testament, written by the bloke whose name it is. Daniel was how you pronounced his Hebrew name. Now, Daniel spoke about a period of empires, and it was so accurate that although he lived 500 years before Christ, people who just couldn't believe the accuracy of his prophecy of these 4 future emperors who were to live 200 years before Christ said he must have lived in that time. He couldn't have lived 500 years before Christ. He must have lived 200 years before Christ. But sadly, for those folk who say that, I'm afraid to say for them that historically it's been proven, separate to the Bible, that Daniel lived in Babylon at the time the Bible claims. So how did he know? So we've got all these books that are inspired, but the Apocrypha has none of that. The Apocrypha, those 14 books, Jesus never quotes from them. Paul never quotes from them. The Apostles, Peter, John, never quote from them. So therefore, it's been established that they're not inspired by God. So that was the Old Testament. Then the New Testament came with people that had met Jesus Christ, they lived with him, they worked with him. Others hadn't, but they knew about him. And just as it was in those days, they recorded what they had seen and heard as, again, God inspired them to do. And once again, it won't surprise you to know that they also talk about the future. Things like, little things, let's say, like towards the end of this time, there will be a great falling away of the church and a difficulty in witnessing. That's interesting, isn't it? Go back 100 years and everyone was talking about their faith, didn't bother about them at all. Churches were full. Not now. Oh, but the Bible spoke about that. And lots more. So, again, there were a number of books in the New Testament. It was very difficult to get those scrolls together. So they were put together in one because it was soon realised that actually a lot of these books, if not all of them, and indeed all of them, had this same inspiration. So then they were put together as the Bible, which is what we have today. So that's a very sort of short whistle-stop tour of how the Bible was written, why it was written, and why it is pretty obvious that it is inspired by something more than just the people reading it. And that's how I would start into that question. If somebody says, how can you possibly believe the Bible? I would start with that.